Everybody. Today we are in Unit 7, Day 8, and we're going to be talking about the beginning of World War II. I put a quote on here from FDR that he would make in April of 1945, and he would say, "We seek peace, enduring peace, more than an end to war. We want an end to the beginning of all wars." Now, as we jump into World War II here, you're going to see a lot of Americans kind of had this sentiment. We didn't want to get involved in war, and we wanted peace. That's generally what people want in the end. You don't see a lot of times in history where people, you do have a certain subset of the population that might be clamoring for war, but most people know what war means, and most people don't want war. And really, even though FDR is making this at what would be close to the end of World War II, you're going to see, again, people don't want to go to war. And that's going to be the general American attitude we're going to see until Pearl Harbor. So we're going to start with looking at how did we get to December 7th, 1941? What brought us to that fateful day? So starting on the Japanese side, you're going to see that the Japanese grow very aggressive over in Asia. Japanese troops, in defiance of the open door policy, as well as the League of Nations, in September of 1931, they would march into Manchuria. And when there, they would create a puppet government within Manchuria. The League of Nations, again, when we talked about the end of World War I, we talked about how the League of Nations, because the United States wasn't in it, it didn't really have a lot of teeth or a lot of power. And with that, you're going to see that the League would pass a resolution condemning Japan, but never would actually take action against Japan. The United States would create what was known as the Stimson Doctrine, named after the U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson. And what that declared was that the U.S. would refuse to recognize the legitimacy of any regime that had been established by force. The League of Nations would agree with this, but again, in a lot of ways, it was kind of hollow words. Yes, the United States, we wouldn't recognize that, but what effect is that really going to have? Now, of course, Japan wouldn't be too happy with us doing that. But again, the real question is, what effect will that really have? So what is FDR's foreign policy? Again, during FDR, the early part of his presidency, he was really, really concerned with just the Great Depression. As a result, you're going to see he doesn't really do a lot with foreign policy. He kind of just extended what Hoover had already done as far as improving relations with Latin America. You would have the Pan-American conferences, which we had discussed before during imperialism. That would happen again. And in that, you're going to see the U.S. would pledge not to intervene in the internal affairs of Latin America, which would make Latin America happy. As far as Cuba goes, FDR would persuade Congress to get rid of that Platt Amendment. If you remember the Platt Amendment, that basically said that we could intervene in Cuba if we needed to. So that was gotten rid of, which again, that's going to make Cuba happy. And then as far as Mexico goes, you're going to see that FDR would refuse to intervene there when the Mexican government decided to seize property owned by U.S. corporations. FDR decides to stay out of that. So you're going to see that he does a lot of things that would help improve relationships with Latin America and Mexico. But overall, his foreign policy, again, he didn't really have an extensive one during his first couple terms, you could say, because he was more focused on what was happening here at home, as were most Americans. As far as economics go, you'll see 1933, FDR would grant recognition to the Soviet Union. Republican presidents of the 1920s had not done that. Remember, the Soviet Union comes around after the Russian Revolution during World War I. FDR said the purpose of recognizing the Soviet Union would be to increase U.S. trade. Now, just because we recognize the Soviet Union did not mean that we trusted them. And we'll come back to that once we start talking about the Cold War. The Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1934, Congress passed this act to help provide for the independence of the Philippines by 1946 and the removal of U.S. troops. Again, you could say a lot of this was done for economic reasons. It costs a lot of money to govern the Philippines. And remember, we had been in control of them since the Spanish-American War. And so, again, this was seen as a way to help the U.S. save money and having to worry about and administer to the Philippines. Congress was also given the power to reduce the U.S. tariff for up to 50% for nations that reciprocated with reducing their tariffs for the United States as well. So, again, this was seen as a way to build our relationships with other countries, but also helping economically when we were in the middle of the Great Depression. So, we're looking at the buildup of World War II. You're going to see the rise of fascism around the world. Of course, you're going to have Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, and Tojo in Japan. And President Roosevelt would warn with this, and he would say that these countries had sold their heritage of freedom for the illusion of living. Now, we hear the term fascism thrown around a lot today. We got the anti-fascists that protests in a lot of cities and that kind of thing. But what is fascism really? What is it in reality? It's the idea that people should glorify their nation and their race through an aggressive show of force. And you're going to see that is exactly what these three leaders are going to do in Europe and Asia. And again, fascism is almost like this hyper extreme love of your nation, which I would say isn't necessarily wrong, but then it is coupled with military force, and a love of your specific race as well, which is when things get really, really dangerous. So why the move towards fascism? Japan rose in the 1930s. We talked about with World War I how Japan was there for the Treaty of Versailles, but they felt like that they were treated differently at the peace table and weren't given to certain promises that had been made to them. So you're going to have that discontent. Plus, they want to expand their empire to obtain more raw materials to help build up their country. So that's why you're going to see a move towards fascism there. Italy, Mussolini would come to power in 1922. Again, Italy had been very unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles, which had not rewarded them with land. Again, that's something that Italy felt like that they deserved after World War I. They did not get that, and that led to a lot of unhappiness there. And there were these dreams of overseas empire. Again, Mussolini's grand dream was reestablishing the former Roman Empire all over Europe. And so as part of starting that dream of the Roman Empire, they would begin with an invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. And then you have Germany. Hitler would come to power in 1933. We've talked about with the Great Depression as well as World War I, what that did economically to Germany. You're going to see there's going to be a lot of resentment within Germany due to the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. There was an economic depression there. A lot of their economy, again, had been handicapped because of the reparations and other things that were put in place on Germany. There was also a fear of communism there. Again, a lot of people tend to think of Hitler as a communist, but Hitler did not like communism. So there was this fear of communism, labor unrest, and rising unemployment. This really kind of created fertile grounds for Hitler and what his view of Germany was and how he perceived Germany to really, again, provided that fertile ground for those ideals to grow. You're going to see Hitler comes to power in 1933, and he starts breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1935, and through rearming the country, which, again, that was something that had been permitted or prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles, but no one really does anything to stop him. And again, especially when we talk about this, Italy and Germany, both of these countries were economically in trouble during the 1920s. And again, you can say that helped really pave the way for fascism in those countries. Now, as far as Americans were concerned, Americans wanted to stay out of what was happening over in Europe. Americans were still very disillusioned after World War I, and Americans did not want to be drawn into another foreign war. Japan, as people started looking at what Japan, Germany, and Italy was going to do, you might say that might push for more people to want to get involved. But no, people looked at it and said, look, we do not want to get involved in all the mess that is going over in these other countries. We just want to be left alone here in the United States. So as a result of that, you're going to see, because of the general idea or the general sentiment among the American people was they wanted to avoid war. You'd have in 1935, the Neutrality Act acts passed, and those would be amended and added to over the coming years. The first one authorized the president to prohibit all arms shipments and forbid U.S. travel on the ships of belligerent nations. If you remember World War I, a big reason we got involved was that unrestricted German submarine warfare. Again, if Americans weren't getting on these ships of these belligerent nations, hopefully that's something we could avoid. 36, we forbade the extension of loans and credits to belligerent nations. And then by 37, forbade the shipment of arms to opposing sides in the Civil War in Spain, because Spain was going through the Spanish Civil War during this time. You'd see a military dictatorship would eventually win there. But again, we were trying to avoid any way that we could of stepping into possible conflicts with other countries. And that's why you're going to see there's so much movement towards, hey, we're not going to deal with belligerent nations at all. You could say that's what got us in the War of 1812. That's what got us in the World War I. We just want to avoid that as much as we can. Also during this time, you're going to see the formation of the America First Committee. This was done in 1940. Isolationists would form this committee to mobilize public opinion against the war effort. The biggest person that promotes this would be the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh. He would travel all across the country, warning against re-engaging in Europe's troubles during this time. You can see some of the propaganda there that they would produce for their side. Again, they would be very much against the war. Now, over in Europe, what was going on? You're going to see that Britain and France decide to follow this policy of appeasement. Now, when you hear the term appeasement today, and when most people say this, most historians say this, everybody's kind of like, man, that was a huge failure, because you're going to see it was a huge failure. So Britain and France, they said, hey, maybe if we just appease Germany and we keep them happy, they won't mess with us. They'll be happy, with whatever they get, and they won't start trying to invade, maybe France and England and that kind of stuff. So in Munich, they would sign what was known as the Munich Agreement, and this would allow Hitler to get away with small acts of aggression and expansion. So we've already talked about in 35, Italy would invade Ethiopia. 36, Hitler orders troops into the Rhineland. Again, that had been taken from Germany after World War I. In 37, Japan would invade China. The Japanese would bomb and sink a U.S. gunboat. Japan would apologize, and the U.S. would accept. And then 38, you're going to see British and French leaders would agree to allow Hitler to take the Sudetenland and that area. So this idea of appeasement of, if we let Hitler have these little parts of land that he wants, a lot of it was stuff that had been taken from Germany after World War I. Maybe he will be happy with that, and he will leave us alone. Now, we have the benefit of 2020 vision, looking backwards and knowing that it would not work out. Now, when we're talking about Japan, I always like to bring attention to Nanking, China. You're going to see that Japan, like I said, they do invade China. And when they invade China, they do some really horrific things within China. They would brutalize the people in invaded China through rape, mass killings, and a host of other atrocities. Estimates range are up to 300,000 killed in Nanking by the Japanese. And Iris Chang, she would write the book there about the rape of Nanking, is what she called it. And you can see the numbers there on the screen about the high number of women that were raped within China. Personally, I had never really heard about this because you're going to see after the war, China didn't really want to talk about this because it was considered embarrassing to them that they were disgraced in such a way. Of course, Japan didn't want to talk about it. But when I read this book right here, The Rape of Nanking, it really opened my eyes. We always hear about the Holocaust and what happened there and all the atrocities there. But atrocities were also happening where Japan had invaded China. So I encourage you, the library might have that book. If not, the public library definitely has it. And it really opens your eyes to what was happening over there and how horrific those type of things were. And here's some pictures from the Nanking massacre. And again, I could go through the list of atrocities there, but again, I encourage you to read that book because it really is eye-opening. Now, in 1937, FDR would give what was known as his quarantine speech. And in this speech, he would propose that democracies act together to quarantine the aggressors. Public reaction was very negative to this speech because, again, it had it looked like to Americans that he was trying to get us involved in the war. So again, he quickly pulls back and drops this whole idea of quarantine altogether. On the backside of this, though, you're going to see that Congress did agree with FDR on increasing the military and naval budgets by 2/3. Americans accepted this. They saw it not as us preparing for war, but as doing this as a way of protecting ourselves as a country in case Germany or Japan or some other country were to come over here and try to mess with us. Now, you're going to see that this policy of appeasement, again, not working out. In March of 1939, Hitler would break the Munich Agreement of Appeasement by sending troops to occupy Czechoslovakia. They would do that and march in there and take over Czechoslovakia very, very quickly. In August of that year, Stalin would surprise Britain and France by signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Britain and France had assumed Stalin would actually side with them, but they did not realize that secretly Hitler and Stalin had already decided to both invade Poland and basically divide it between the two countries. So again, this doesn't mark the start of World War II, but again shows how Hitler is being very, very aggressive and how Britain and France really aren't doing anything at all about it, except, we're not happy about that, but that's not going to go a long way. All right, so World War II. When does a World War II officially start? September 1st, 1939, Hitler would launch what would be known as Blitzkrieg or Fast War against Poland, and that is officially going to start World War II. You're going to see Britain and France after he invades Poland. That's when they officially declare war on Germany. The USSR would invade the other side of Poland and other Baltic countries. There you can see on the map. By 1940, Germany, again, is going to be attacking and conquering France very quickly, Denmark, and Norway. So things move very, very quickly, and it's at this point you realize that appeasement did not work. Now, what would the U.S. do in all of this? Again, the U.S. stays neutral in this. You're going to see 84% of Americans supported Britain and France, but most did not want to get into war. Again, we still had this bad taste in our mouth from World War I, and we did not want to get involved in the war. Meanwhile, Germany would turn its eyes on Great Britain and would start the bombing of Britain during this time. Now, you see here a Dr. Seuss cartoon. You'll see a lot of Dr. Seuss cartoons where he's very critical of the United States not getting involved in World War II, and a lot of people don't realize that Dr. Seuss was very involved in creating political cartoons during World War II. I think it's the University of North Carolina. They actually have a database of all of his political cartoons from World War II, which you can go check out. And with Dr. Seuss, too, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of his writings did have like a political nature behind them, such as Horton Hears a Who. He would write that after going to Japan after World War II and seeing the devastation that the atomic bombs had and other things. But yeah, Dr. Seuss was very critical of the United States not getting involved in World War II. So you're going to see with this a change in U.S. policy. The United States is going to start showing ways that we're going to be somewhat inclined to getting involved in the war. In 1939, Congress would adopt what is known as the cash and carry provision by adopting a less restrictive neutrality act, which provided that a belligerent could buy U.S. arms, so we could sell U.S. arms to a belligerent country, but they had to pay cash and they had to come get it themselves. Again, this was technically a neutral type idea, but you're going to see that Britain dominated the seas, so it was very clear that this was going to benefit Britain more than it was any other country. In 1940, Congress would pass the Selective Service Act, which improves an increase in military spending, as well as the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. And again, you're starting to look at this and be like, man, it really does seem like we are preparing for war in this, even though we want to stay out of that. Also in 1940, we'd pay Congress would pass the Destroyers for Bases deal. 50 World War I destroyers would be traded to Great Britain in exchange for the right to build military bases on British property in the Atlantic. So again, we want to stay out of war, but it's become very, very clear that we are benefiting Britain in the war. So if you can imagine, if you're Germany in this, you're probably saying, hey, the United States is siding with Germany or with England, even though they say they are staying out of the war. So that brings us to the election of 1940. Now, at this point, FDR had served 2 terms, And as the tradition started by George Washington, every other president that had served 2 terms stepped down at the end of their second term and allowed someone else. FDR would break this tradition and run for a 3rd term against Republican Wendell Willkie. And as you can see here, he would easily win the election. Now, FDR's reasoning behind this was because of what was happening over in Europe and because of Hitler's aggressive actions. He felt like that it was best to have continuity in leadership and not step down from the presidency. Of course, you're going to see a ton of criticism come his way for doing this. But again, most Americans, I think, would accept that because they knew what was happening in the world during that time. So in January of 1941, again, the United States is still not involved in the war. You're going to see, again, FDR will make this quote saying, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." During this time, he would give his 4 Freedoms speech. And in this speech, he would propose lending money to Britain to purchase U.S. war materials. He justified it by arguing the U.S. must help other nations defend 4 freedoms: speech, religion, and he also talked about freedom from want and freedom from fear. Congress would authorize the president through the Lend-Lease Act to lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of arms and other equipment to countries whose defense was considered vital to the security of the U.S. Now, FDR, to calm people in this, he would compare this to lending a garden hose to a next-door neighbor whose house is on fire. So again, if you lend a garden hose to somebody, it's not going to help put out the fire on a large scale, but it'll help a little bit. And again, you can see Dr. Seuss there, very critical of this. So, as you can tell, war, at least for the United States, is becoming more and more imminent. In June of 1941, Hitler would turn his back on the Soviets. He would break that agreement that they had signed earlier and begins an invasion of the Soviet Union. The U.S. would then extend the Lend-Lease to the Soviets, who would become part of the Allies because now the Soviets were fighting against the Germans. Also in 1941, you would have Roosevelt and Churchill meet together and sign what was known as the Atlantic Charter. And basically, this would lay kind of the groundwork for what the war effort was going to look like if the United States got involved. And it talked about economic collaboration, political stability, free trade, national self-determination, as well as collective security. And many Americans don't realize by September of 1941, again, even though it wouldn't be till to December till we got in the war, the U.S. and Germany were already fighting naval battles in the Atlantic. FDR kept the American public in the dark for this, and with this, he doesn't ask for war. You'll see in October of 1941, the USS Reuben James sunk by a German U-boat. You'd have 115 Americans died. So even though we were not involved in the war, we were already having military conflicts at sea with the Germans, who were very aggressive with their submarines. Again, with that, you'll see off the coast of the Outer Banks in North Carolina, this area became known as Torpedo Alley because how frequently German U-boats were off of the Outer Banks and were sinking American vessels there. Not military vessels, not necessarily all military vessels, but merchant vessels and that kind of thing. It eventually got to the point where U.S. naval vessels did have to escort merchant ships through that area because of how many ships that you were having sink there. So again, we tend to think of World War II not really touching the United States until Pearl Harbor. But again, things were already happening right off our coast. Now, with Japan, in September 1940, the U.S. prohibited the export of steel and iron to all countries except for Britain and the Western Hemisphere. Again, the purpose of this was specifically aimed at hurting Japan, who had recently joined the Axis powers. So we didn't name Japan in this, but we aimed it at Japan. July 1941, you'll see Japanese troops occupy French Indochina. Roosevelt at that point freezes all Japanese credits in the U.S. and cuts off the Japanese access to U.S. oil. Again, think about the Japanese. They are not going to be very, very happy about this. So to help calm tensions with the Japanese, you're going to see the U.S. and Japan would enter into negotiations, but really those negotiations would go nowhere. Neither side would change its position. In a lot of ways, the United States was actually stalling to try to give us time to build up our military in the Pacific. Because of this, you're going to see that Japan realizes, hey, they might be stalling, and they believe that quick action was necessary because of their limited oil supplies. And because we had cut off that oil, they really really couldn't build up their war machine or country anymore. So that leads us to December 7th, 1941. While in negotiations with the U.S., Japan would attack the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. With this attack, they would destroy much of the American Pacific Fleet and kill several thousand Americans. Again, this would be the largest military attack just against the U.S. by a foreign country to this point in history. Now, much is made, and some people question why the U.S. government didn't do more, because high-ranking U.S. officials knew an attack was coming in the Pacific, but they didn't know where, and they didn't know the date of the attack. But they knew that something probably was coming. We had picked up enough signs and enough information to know that something was coming. We didn't know where. Now, people critical of FDR like to say that they think that FDR knew and he just didn't do anything because he wanted the U.S. to pull our U.S. pulled into the war. Even though me personally, I'm not the biggest FDR fan, I don't see it within a U.S. president to allow thousands of Americans to die just because you want to get pulled into a war. Again, that's my personal opinion with this. But now it is clear that the United States would be involved in war. Again, I've never gotten to go to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. If you go there, they have a memorial for the people who died, the USS Arizona. You can see that ship. It was determined that it was better to leave that under the water. It would be better for the environment just to leave it rather than pull it out. And so you can see the ship is still there under the water today. So with this, again, no longer could we avoid war. The U.S. would declare war. Roosevelt would describe December 7th as a date which would live in infamy. FDR would ask Congress to declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the U.S. and the Japanese Empire. And on December 8th, the Congress would declare war. There would only be one member of Congress that would vote against that. That would be Jeannette Rankin, who we talked about previously, was the first woman elected to Congress, but she was a pacifist, which is why she dissented from us joining. So World War II officially becomes a world war. Hitler and Mussolini honor their pact with Japan, declare war on the United States, and now it's clear the U.S. could no longer be isolationist, and World War II was now officially a world war, and the U.S. was fully involved. So if you're looking at World War II and saying overall, why did the U.S. get involved? Because of German and Japanese aggression. So that shows, again, that whole process of how we got involved. And in the next couple classes, we'll be talking about the war itself and what that actually looked like there. So I hope you have a great day.